Good evening. I've just briefed the members of the Security Council on my visit to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK. The visit was the first in-depth political exchange of views between the UN Secretariat and officials in Pyongyang in almost 8 years. In Pyongyang, I had lengthy discussions with the Foreign Minister and the Vice Foreign Minister, Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho and Vice Foreign Minister Pak Myung-guk, who agreed that the current situation on the Korean Peninsula was the most tense and dangerous peace and security issue in the world today. I stressed the urgent need to prevent miscalculation and reduce the risk of conflict. We have no time to waste. I reiterated the call for the full implementation of all relevant Security Council resolutions. I underlined that the international community is both committed to a peaceful political solution to the situation on the Korean Peninsula and united in its opposition to the DPRK's pursuit of nuclear weapons. I emphasized the importance of opening or reopening technical channels of communication, such as the military-to-military hotline, to reduce risks, to signal intentions to prevent misunderstandings, and manage any crisis. I also urged the DPRK to signal that it was prepared to consider a different direction, prepared to consider engagement, talks about talks. The UN or others can facilitate both of these processes if desired. My interlocutors and I agreed that my visit was only a beginning and that we should continue our dialogue. I also had discussions with UN colleagues in the diplomatic community, and I learned of an anticipated humanitarian funding shortfall that could seriously affect the ordinary citizens of the DPRK who need our generosity and our help. I'd like to conclude these opening remarks just with a personal observation. You know, in my professional career, this was certainly the most important mission I've ever undertaken, and I felt the sense of responsibility on my shoulders throughout the time that I was there. Time will tell what was the impact of our discussions, but I think we've left the door ajar. And I fervently hope that the door to a negotiated solution will now be opened wide. So I'd be happy to take a few questions.
Yes, thank you. Undersecretary General Pamela Falk from CBS News. As you may know, Secretary of State Tillerson just talked about no preconditions to the talks as far as the United States is concerned, and that there will be diplomacy until the first bomb drops. Do you think that is helpful? And what did you get in Pyongyang about where the next step would be in negotiations? Thank you.
Well, Pamela, I just came from the Security Council, and the Security Council was united on the fact that we need a political solution. And if you look at the Security Council resolution that was passed on September 11th, 2373, there's an important part of that resolution that does call for a peaceful, political, diplomatic solution. So I would underscore the fact that was the message I took to Pyongyang, was that the international community is committed to that type of solution as reflected in a Security Council resolution that was passed unanimously. But we have to get there by opening the door to a different direction from the current trajectory.
What was their answer to you?
They agreed that it was important to prevent war. You know, the North Korean interlocutors agreed it was important to prevent war. How we do that was the topic of 15+ hours of discussions. Now, you know, I've been part of a foreign ministry myself. I know how this stuff works. The people who we met listened carefully to our arguments. They explored our thinking. They asked questions. They argued with us. But ultimately, they have to take what we said and talk about it internally, talk about it with their leadership. So that's why I'm reluctant to say now what is the impact of our visit, what is the impact of our pressing to move forward on the political track, because they need time to digest and consider what the, how they will respond to our message.
Mr. Feltman, just to follow on from that, Tillerson in fact offered to begin talks with North Korea with no preconditions. Did you get any sense from the North Koreans that they are willing to talk to the Americans now? And what are your next steps? What happens now?
I mean, we emphasized to the DPRK officials who spent lots of time with us that we really believe that they need to signal that they're willing now to go in a different direction, to start some kind of engagement, just to start talking about talks. And I think they listened seriously to our arguments. As I said, they explored them with us, but they were not. They did not offer any type of commitment to us at that point. I think that they have to reflect on what we said with their own leadership, and I don't want to try to suggest I can read the minds of my interlocutors or put words in their mouth.
Ariana King with Nikkei. So in your statement earlier, you noted some difficulties with procurement and funding gaps. I was wondering if you could give a little bit more detail on what exactly that meant. Is that linked somehow to Security Council sanctions? And what is your sense of the effect or the impact of Security Council sanctions on the country?
I mean, at one level, sanctions helped us make some points we wanted to make, which is that there is international consensus, as reflected in the Security Council resolutions passed unanimously. I think they were very much focused on one particular member state, one I know quite well, and we were trying to help them understand that whatever the problems are between Pyongyang and Washington, that they have a larger issue to deal with, which is that the international community does not accept this nuclear program. The international community has suspended nuclear testing for more than 2 decades. They're the only country that defies that. So the sanctions helped us in terms of showing that the problem is not simply a Washington-Pyongyang problem. What I was concerned about, though, in talking to UN colleagues and doing some site visits, was the reduction in funding to the UN appeal for programs in the DPRK. The UN had an appeal for 2017 of $114 million. It was only 30% funded. That's having a bigger impact on how the UN can deliver on its humanitarian programs than any unintended consequences of sanctions. We did talk about some of the technical challenges of sanctions, of how working through the 1718 Committee for exemptions might be eased. But again, I was more concerned about the overall lack of funding for the UN humanitarian appeal, which affects the UN's ability to deliver life-saving assistance on the ground.
One follow-up? Sure, thanks a lot. We've had press conferences here by the mission asking, they've written to the Secretary General and asked him to convene some conference on the legality of the sanctions. Did they reiterate that to you, and do you see any role for the Secretary General himself in this process?
Mr. Lee, it was something that came up. It wouldn't surprise you. They've raised this quite frequently, and so we discussed this. But their argument, to the extent that I can accurately portray it, their argument is that the Security Council sanctions are contrary to the Charter, and therefore there needs to be some kind of mechanism to look at this the way that a state would have a constitutional court looking at laws passed being consistent with constitutions. But the reality is that the Charter is something quite different than what they're describing, that the United Nations is not the equivalent of a member state. And I'm not a lawyer, but we talked a lot about what the Charter actually says, that Article 39 gives the exclusive authority to the Security Council to decide, is something a threat to international peace and security? And if so, the Security Council has the authority to decide what actions to take, what actions to take under Articles 41 and 42. So this is something that I think they will continue to bring up with us, but it's something where it's really the Security Council's prerogatives, we firmly believe that, to decide itself what measures are appropriate when they've identified a threat to international peace and security.
And the Secretary General?
Follow up on the question of the sanctions, and is the lack of funding for the appeal linked directly to sanction? People not funding it because of sanctions, and also second question is, did you ask to meet with Kim Jong-un?
I don't know what I suppose the overall atmosphere around the DPRK and the unease that the international community has with the DPRK's nuclear military program has contributed to this. And there's a sense of from some countries, I think that, well, these problems are self-inflicted, they could be resolved if the DPRK had different priorities. I think that's contributed to this. But the fact of the matter is the UN assistance is saving lives, that the people that there is a high percentage of the population that is food insecure, and the UN has been helping in a number of areas, and we really believe this is important. Moreover, by having the drop in funding, it reinforces a narrative that I heard over and over again from the DPRK, which is that the international community is inherently hostile to the DPRK. It's not simply because of the nuclear military program. There's an inherent hostility that's reflected in some of these decisions to reduce funding, is their belief. So I hope that for both life-saving reasons and for political reasons, we're able to generate more funding. I did not ask to see the Supreme Leader, but I assume from the discussions I had with the Foreign Minister, with the Deputy Foreign Minister and his team, that they will be briefing their leadership on the content of our discussions.
Will the Secretary General meet with him?
We haven't talked. We've talked about the fact that we need to keep a policy dialogue going between the Secretariat and the DPRK, given the urgency of these issues. But we didn't talk specifically about who talks to whom when.
Sorry, my name is Hiroshi with Fuji TV. Just to make sure, so did North Korea talk about anything about stopping their missile developments on any conditions or not? Can you?
I can't characterize everything that they said to us behind closed doors. It's not appropriate. What I can say is we made the points as forcefully as we can. We reinforced them with many arguments. They listened carefully. They debated us. They explored our points. They took careful notes. I am hopeful that they'll be able to convey accurately our concerns about the risks of the current direction, that they will reflect those concerns accurately. And again, we will see over time if there's been a significant impact to these discussions or not. I think that I would characterize the trip as constructive and productive in being able to convey the concerns of the Secretary General that of course derives from the concerns of the international community and the Security Council. I believe that we were able to do that. But whether it was successful in persuading them to accept some of our suggestions, only time will tell.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
The military
Thank you much.
exercises.
Thank you.
Did you agree to speak again at a certain date?